Very, very pleased to be here, and I'm sure I can say the same for Sarah. It's been a long time coming, and this is, what a location, just beautiful. So we're going to do the talk in sort of two halves. I'm going to focus more on just what is TBI, how do we diagnose it, and I'll pay a little bit of attention to blast exposure, but Sarah will get into that a little bit more detail. I'll look at the signs and symptoms of TBI, the recovery trajectory, and then Sarah's going to focus more on what are the changes that actually occur in the brain and also the body in response to traumatic brain injury, and what are some strategies to avoid traumatic brain injury and also treatment strategies. So let's get started. This is just if anyone has any questions afterwards that come to mind, please email either Sarah or I. We'd love to catch up with you or connect with you. So I'll, even if you wanted a copy of these slides or anything like that, you can always email one of us and we can forward that on to you. So a little bit of demographics here. Really, what is the traumatic brain injury, the overarching group of different types of traumatic injury? It's really looking at a direct and can be an indirect biomechanical force that is transmitted through to the brain. And there's various different mechanisms in which that can occur. There's quite a high incidence of traumatic brain injury in Australia, about 200,000 TBI cases per year, but most of those, nearly 90% of those, are actually what we call mild traumatic brain injury or concussion. 1 in 5 children at some stage before the age of 16 will actually experience a traumatic brain injury, so that's quite astounding figures. And if we look at the most severe form of traumatic brain injury, which is called severe TBI, that actually has a mortality rate of 30 to 40%. So the name really is appropriate. And less than 50% of those who have traumatic brain injury will fully recover back to the same level of independence and their level of productivity. So it has a huge burden on the individual, and as you can see, it also has a huge financial burden. This $2 billion plus direct lifetime costs equates to about $9 billion a year in total. So when we look at TBI, so I'll just refer to it as TBI from now on, because it's a bit of a tongue twister, but we can actually classify it in several different ways, and most often it's classified in terms of the level of severity. So it's often referred to as either being mild, moderate, or a severe form of traumatic brain injury. But you can also look at it as, is this the first traumatic brain injury that's occurred, so the primary, or is it the actual secondary? So how many times has that individual actually had a traumatic brain injury? You can also look at it in terms of the location. And when we're thinking about mild forms of traumatic brain injury, it's usually a wide, diffuse area of the brain that's actually been affected. But you can also have traumatic brain injury that's more localized to a small region of the brain. So how do we actually determine who has mild, who has moderate, and who has the more severe type? There are several different ways of looking at different outcomes. You can use the very broadly used Glasgow Coma scale, and I'll go into that a little bit more detail in the next slide. But these are basically a rating of looking at the amount of eye movement, the amount of verbal responses and motor responses, which are movement to do with muscles, looking at the levels of those responses and giving it a rating. And the higher the rating, in this instance, the better. So if we look at someone who gets a rating of 13 to 15, that's actually regarded as someone who would have what's called a mild traumatic brain injury. And interchangeably, certainly in Australia, we usually use concussion or mild TBI, and they're mostly the same. In some groups, they'll actually differentiate them and say that mild TBI is someone who shows some sort of abnormality in imaging, whereas if they have imaging and no abnormality is present, then they can be, it's more referred to as concussion. But a lot of the times, the two are used interchangeably. On the Glasgow Coma scale, if they're 9 to 12, then they're regarded as moderate TBI, and 3 to 8, 3 being the lowest score that you can achieve, and typically people who achieve that score would be unconscious. There are different assessments in terms of consciousness. If there's just an altered or reduced level of consciousness, if that's less than 24 hours, they're mild. If it's greater than 24 hours, they could be moderate or could be severe. It would then look at, the clinician would then look at the loss of consciousness. So if there was a loss of consciousness between 0 to 30 minutes, then they would be mild. So that could equal no loss of consciousness. So to have mild traumatic brain injury, you don't actually have to have had a loss of consciousness. So the range is 0 to 30. Greater than 30 but less than 24 hours, it would be considered a mild traumatic brain injury, and greater than 24 hours, a more serious TBI. Another factor that's looked at is the memory loss, so the post-traumatic amnesia. So if the person has a memory loss of 24 hours or less, they're regarded as being potentially mild. Greater than 24 hours but less than a week long, it's moderate, and that's a considerable amount of time to suffer from amnesia. Or greater or equal to a week, it's severe. So these are the sort of assessments that they'll look at, the factors that they analyse in order to say, okay, you've got a mild, you've got a moderate, and you have a severe TBI. This just goes a little bit more into the Glasgow Coma scale. These are the different things in each one of these categories, whether they're looking at eye-opening response, so it's either there's no response and they would get a score of 1, or they can spontaneously move their eyes around like we can here today. Verbal response, are you able to ask them a question such as, oh, what's your name, where are you, what is the date, and they're able to respond to that, they would get a score of 5, compared to if they were unconscious, they would provide no response. And lastly, this is looking at a movement analysis. So if you ask them to sort of raise their arm to the side or move their fingers, they're able to do so, compared to not able to move. So a score of 3, that's the minimum score you can achieve, and that person would be most likely unconscious. A little bit on blast brain injury, and it can be called many different things: blast exposure, blast overexposure, military TBI, or blast-induced neurotrauma. So it comes under many different names. When it comes down to it, it's all looking at the impact that these high energy given off by a blast. So the explosion released the high energy. It's an increase in pressure and compression. That could be air, but it could also be water pressure and compression. And that is exerted outwards in a supersonic manner. Now, when we look at the blast wave, you can see from the red area on the graph, here we have at baseline just normal atmospheric pressure. And at the initiation of the explosion, you can see there's a very steep rise there to meet a peak over pressure, and then it will decline. But as it comes back to the normal baseline atmospheric pressure, so this is a positive increase in pressure, it actually overcompensates and you get a drop in pressure, so you get a negative pressure. So you get this increased pressure that's exerted on the brain, and then a decreased pressure, and that can occur in waves. So looking at some statistics from the US, those that were interviewed and asked if they'd suffered from concussion, about 67% of that cohort actually said that they had been diagnosed with a blast injury, and it was the most common injury type in the military, but many were not diagnosed. So although that's alarming statistic, it really underestimates the realistic number of those in the military that have blast exposure. And really, when you think of a lot of exposures, whether it's air, chemicals, things that you inhale, there's really stringent exposure standards. But here, when it comes to the limits of the energy exerted from these types of blasts, there really is no entirely determined limit. So it really varies. So these blasts can actually be a direct or indirect, so within the vicinity or coming from other nearby energy releases. And you can actually have this low level type of blast exposure where it's not enough to actually initiate symptoms. So the individual is not aware that anything negative has happened to them, but you're getting these repeated low-level blast exposures that accumulate over time. So they're worrying because the person is not symptomatic, so they allow these exposures to continue, and the repeated exposures are associated with more significant detrimental effects. But most of these exposures actually occur during training. Now, this is just not even an exhaustive list of all the different ways in which they can actually assess whether you have concussion or not, and some of them are specialised to look at in sporting, some of them are used in research. There's quite a lot of different tests, and there's no actual, like if you were testing someone and you wanted to see if they had diabetes, then you could do an HbA1c. There's very determined things that you can assess in order to be able to diagnose them with a condition. But when it comes to concussion, you're really just looking at a whole plethora of signs and symptoms. And these are all the different ways that you can assess those signs and symptoms. But there also is one that's specific to the military called the Military Acute Concussion Evaluation. And here is just a list of some of the things that they would actually assess when they're doing this evaluation. Some of them are just asking the individual what their symptoms are, but some of the tests are a little bit less subjective, where they're assessing motor or eye movements, balance, coordination. So the way that the sort of a more inclusive look at what is assessed when doing this type of questionnaire and these different types of testing is you've got a whole battery of things that you can use, and a lot of them are just asking the person for their symptoms, and their symptoms may be more, how are you feeling, what does your are you feeling nauseous? Do you have headaches? Are you feeling dizzy? It's really a lot of subjective type of assessments. What's your mood like? All of those types of things are it's necessary to find out. But then you can also assess signs. And so signs, when you're looking at signs, these are really things that are a lot less subjective, a lot more measurable. And it's good to have a combination of both of those. The one on the bottom right-hand side, these are actual tests that can be done where you're assessing someone's balance. You can do questionnaires to assess their cognitive capacity, the oculomotor impairment. This is where you're actually testing certain areas of the brain that are controlling eye movements. The oculomotor is a nerve in the brain that actually controls a lot of our eye movements. And you can also, which is not done very often, but you can look for some elevated biomarkers in the blood that can be indicative of damage of neurons in the brain, of these cells in the brain. These are also clinical signs. You can just talk to them and see if they are able to answer questions properly. You can see if they have memory issues if they seem to be in a relaxed state or a bit more agitated. So these are also more objective types of assessments that can be made. Now, when we look at the scope of signs and symptoms, I've tried to sort of tie it into the regions of the brain. So these areas in colour that I've got of the brain, these are looking at what we call the cerebral cortex, and they're the lobes that have pretty significant functions in terms of cognition, in terms of motor control, hearing, memory, and we can tie those in roughly to these regions of the brain. Now, this is not, when we look at the frontal lobe does a whole lot of things, particularly is very responsible for all the movements that we make, but these are the ones that correlate with a lot of the symptoms that people experience in response to concussion. So you can see you've got a lack of focus and attention. There are some mood effects there, irritability, maybe aggression, impulsivity, problems with judgment, and potentially even language difficulties, because there's an area in the frontal lobe there that controls our speech. If we look at the temporal lobe, so that would be this region here above your ears. This is to do with hearing, so it's when we look at vision, that's right at the back, pretty far from the eyes, but the actual area which interprets hearing is actually just above the ears. So you may have difficulties with hearing, and also this is an area that, along with the frontal lobe, has a lot to do with emotional regulation. So those two are really connected together. There's a lot of communication between these regions. And lastly, in the temporal lobe, it controls our short-term and our conversion of short-term memories to long-term memory. The parietal lobe at the back here, so every time you touch or you feel pain or temperature, pressure, that heads to this parietal lobe. So there are some sensory deficits that can occur with damage to this area, but it also helps us be able to work out where our body is within our environment, so that's spatial orientation, and also has a region around here that's to do with reading and comprehension. So there could be some difficulties with that. At the back here, as I said, the occipital lobe at the back, that is all to do with visual interpretation. So damage there, you could have an area of what we call our visual field that you may not be able to see anymore, or you could have blurred vision or double vision. Cerebellum, so the cerebellum, you can see the effects when the cerebellum isn't working as well if you've ever had too much alcohol. So what's the biggest outcome of that? Balance problems, slurred speech. So traumatic brain injury can affect the cerebellum where you have balance and coordination and speech problems. Lastly, with the brainstem has a host of functions to do with our levels of consciousness. A lot of the nerves that control our speech and swallowing emerge from the brainstem, so there could be issues with that. But it also has cardiopulmonary areas in there that control those functions. So the speed of which our heart beats and also our respiration. So there could be some changes in those. So what is the typical trajectory if someone gets a concussion or mild traumatic brain injury? In adults, they usually recover in 1 to 2 weeks. Children take a little bit longer, 2 to 4 weeks. Now, if someone hasn't recovered by 3 months, if they're still symptomatic, any of these these exhaustive symptoms that I've just described, if they're still experiencing some of those symptoms, then they are experiencing persisting post-concussion symptoms. And some groups will say at the 1 month cutoff, and some will say at the 3 month cutoff, that they are then regarded as having persisting post-concussion syndrome. And when you look at the thousands of people that get concussion, we're not able to predict actually who is going to fit into this persisting symptom group. And so there's no actual way of assessing that. And there's a lot of research, particularly in Sarah's group, that are trying to tease that out to see if we can predict who will not recover. There are some risk factors though that put a person, increase their likelihood of not recovering. And so there's quite a few of these features of an individual that may make them at a greater risk. Females 15 to 18, if they use psychoactive drugs, if they're a migraine sufferer, even personality traits, those that are high achievers have been shown to be an increased risk. Learning difficulties, ADHD, sleep disorders. Of course, if you've already experienced a concussion before, you're at greater risk of not recovering or having an extended period of recovery. And a lot of research has been done looking at those that had pre-existing mental health diagnosis, because they are also at a greater risk of not recovering. So this is just to show you the consistency of the brain. I think a lot of people tend to think that it's a lot harder, a lot more dense than it actually is. So it's a really fragile tissue. So what protects it? The most obvious thing would be the skull, because that's on the outside. So the skull bone is the first protection. But when we look internal to that, we actually have most of the brain, 80% of the brain is the actual neural tissue, but 20% of it is actually fluid. Now, some of that fluid will be fluid around cells, some of that fluid will be just your blood supply, but a lot of the fluid is actually what we call cerebrospinal fluid. So some of you may have heard of CSF before. And when you look inside the brain, you can see that we've got these spaces really deep inside the brain, and they're called our ventricles, and they actually produce about 400 to 600 mils of CSF per day. And so at any one time we'll have about 25 mils in these cavities in the brain, but then that leaves and surrounds the brain, so that we have about 125 mils of this fluid around the brain, with the brain floating within it. So it takes the brain from about a 1,500 gram weight to about 50 grams. So the less weight, the less force is transmitted through the brain on impact. So it actually is a pretty important support system to try to protect the brain from outside forces. We also have something called a blood-brain barrier, and this can actually be disrupted in response to traumatic brain injury. So its name really is indicative of what its job is. It's to form a barrier between everything else and the brain, so that if you have an infection, say, in your blood, we don't want that to then be transferred into the central nervous system where your brain and your spinal cord is. So we have lots of different structures that actually help to form this barrier. One of the major things is this big cell here called an astrocyte. You can see it's got these big fat extensions that come out. They're called podocytes, which is just a fancy word for foot process, and they stick on top of all of the blood vessels to create this barrier, and it protects the nervous system from unwanted things, yet it's so magnificent that it allows the entry of nutrients to come into the brain, and it helps us to get rid of stuff we don't want, like all metabolic waste. So We really need this blood-brain barrier to be maintained to protect the nervous system, and this can be disrupted in response to traumatic brain injury. Now, the brain is a highly demanding, it's only about 2% of our body weight, but yet it requires about 1/5 of our oxygen consumption. So about 20% goes to here, and all the rest of the oxygen is for the entire rest of the body. What is it that uses that oxygen? It's what we call the functional unit of the nervous system. So this is what's called a neuron. So there'll be lots of descriptions when you're looking at the responses to traumatic brain injury. There'll be lots of discussion about the neuron, because they're the actual cells that transmit information throughout the nervous system. And they travel long distances, which is why they need these long processes that Sarah's going to get further into, called axons. So axons are wrapped around in this thing called a myelin sheath, which is a fatty sheath, and that actually increases the speed at which things are able to be transmitted along the axon. And you can see when we lose that in conditions such as multiple sclerosis, and that affects transmission of information to muscles, and they have movement issues. So it's very important that we have these axons that have myelin, and they're able to transmit that information along the nervous system. And that's why I call it the almighty neuron, because it's amazing.
Thanks very much. So I'll tell you a little bit about what's happening in the brain when we have an injury, and then I'll show you a little bit of research that's been done on veterans who've had a blast injury, and tell you a little bit about where the research direction's going and the kinds of things we're wanting to do, and where the field is going. So I'll narrate a little bit. So what happens when we have a brain injury? So here's our brain. We're seeing it from the side, or the sagittal view. If we zoom in, this is what our white matter fibres look like, but they're coloured. So this is the kind of thing we can see on an MRI scan, but we colour them in to show the direction that the white matter fibres are going. Now these are our axons, and the yellow, the pink stuff around them is our myelin. And so you can think of myelin as like the coating on a cable. It's helping to improve signal transduction. So zooming in on a microscope image, we have these things called microtubules, and these are the structural scaffolding within the brain. And they're held together by something called tau. In a 3D model of our microtubules in blue and red and yellow, and tau in green in between them, they're kind of a little bit floating in space, but this provides structure to the tiny parts of our brain. And we have these things called vesicles, which are moving on little feet up and down. So they move up to the neuron's cell body, and they take nutrients, and then they take waste away from the cell body. I didn't make this. I don't know why there's a hammer to indicate the injury. It's a little bit crass, but when we have an injury, we have disruption to our microtubules. So for a more severe injury, they tend to rupture. For a mild injury, they may rupture, or they might just get a bit bent out of shape. But what it means is that our vesicles can't continue to walk up to the cell body and can't continue to go away from the cell body. So we're having a disrupted flow of nutrients. We're getting waste building up, and we're having problems in the brain that we're not having effective workings of these cells. So this is what it looks like on a microscope. So this is a brain that's had a brain injury, and you can see that there's no bits missing. This is a fairly normal looking brain. But actually what we're seeing is that we have this damage to the neurons and the axons. And I like to think of it, particularly for milder injuries, as like a rubber band. So you know when you stretch a rubber band, it doesn't always break, but a lot of the time it doesn't go right exactly back how it was. It can be a little bit stretched out. And the more injuries you have, the more stretched out they can be. And it means that our neurons are often still working, the axons are still working, but they're suboptimal. They're not working as they should. And that means that we're not getting efficient information flow, and we're not getting nutrients to the cells as we need, and I'll talk a bit more about that later, and we're not getting rid of waste products. So we think that over time this is causing a lot of problems. So this is what we call a varicosity. So you might have heard of varicose veins. We call them varicosities exactly because they look like a varicose vein. So that's an axon that the bits that are a bit more swollen and a bit uneven are where we're getting that accumulation of our vesicles and our products. And then up here, these are brains from a more severe injury. We get these really swollen, thick axons. And then these little dotty bits here are neurons and their axons that have had a terminal injury. So those ones aren't going to recover. The axon breaks off from the cell body and he rolls up and waits to be cleared off as a waste product. So this is kind of what's happening. It's not uniform throughout the white matter, throughout the brain, so it's very difficult to detect. But it happens to some degree in mild injuries, moderate injuries, and more in severe injuries. So I mentioned that we have these white matter tracts. We zoomed in on them in the video, and we can see what they're doing. So white matter tracts are bundles of axons that are connected to the neuron, and they're traveling through the brain. And they're going in different directions and they're sending information throughout the brain. So they're really, really important. These are our information superhighways. And we can have damage to one area, but most often, especially for mild injuries, there tends not to be a huge area, a huge lesion, a huge area that's damaged, but we tend to have mild injury that's dispersed throughout the brain. So we have, as I said, these myelin coatings that are helping to insulate the information. We also may lose the myelin completely or partially, which impairs again the information signal coming through. So we have these cell damages, damage to our axons, damage to our neurons, but that's not the only thing that's happening. And this is a figure that I really like that was made a few years ago. I think this green thing looks a bit like a whale, but it's actually supposed to be a neuron. So we have our neuron. Amanda talked about our astrocyte and his end feet. Astrocytes are spitting out a whole lot of chemicals saying, I'm in danger, I'm unhappy. They're going into the neuron. The neuron is trying to stop chemicals coming in, and it's trying to stop chemicals going out. So we have an energy imbalance, we have swelling, we have inflammation. So there's, you know, if you cut yourself and you get a little bit of swelling at the site, that happens in the brain as well. So we have these cells coming in and saying, hey, something's wrong. And they send off signals to say, get their mates to come as well, because they say something's wrong in the brain, and they don't detect any difference between an injury or an infection. So all these cells start rushing into the brain, and the inflammation is in general a very helpful thing. You know, our skin regenerates all the time if we have an injury, and that's often due to the neuroinflammatory response that clears off all the damaged areas and the debris, and makes way for wound healing. But in the brain, inflammation actually we call it a double-edged sword. So we have inflammation that initially is good, bringing in the new cells and saying, hey, there's a problem, we've got to clean it up. But it gets out of hand very quickly, and the inflammatory response doesn't stop. And so we have more and more and more cells coming in, and they actually start to damage the tissue which wasn't damaged by the injury. We also have this, what we call metabolic dysfunction. So we need a certain amount of oxygen, we need a certain amount of energy to come into the brain. We're not getting that necessarily after injury, and that can persist, it can come and go. And we have swelling as well. And Amanda mentioned we have the blood-brain barrier disruption. And we used to think that blood-brain barrier was disrupted very rapidly after injury. So you hit your head, blood-brain barrier opens, and then it closes and everything's fine. Then we found out that it opens, maybe 24 hours later, it has closed and it opens again, so we call that biphasic response. But actually now what we think is that people with mild injuries who have symptoms probably have a little bit of a leaky blood-brain barrier. So it's a little bit open, it's not fully open, it's not letting everything in, but there's probably things getting in there that we don't want. So Amanda touched on blast injury, and what it looks like, the different kinds of names that we have. So when we tend to think of blast injury, and particularly when we talk to people who don't have any military experience, they tend to think of a blast injury as something like this. It's an IED, it happens in theatre, but actually, as Amanda said, most of the instances of blast brain injury that we see actually happen in training. So things like breaching, we have a lot of injuries because someone is using a physical blast to enter a building. and the people who are at the front of the line tend to have a higher level exposure compared to the people who are a little bit further away. And the people who are firing certain kinds of weapons, Carl Gustav here, you have two guys here who are firing this one weapon, they're both getting a mild blast exposure when they're firing this weapon. So we know that a lot of different weapon systems may cause some level of blast injury. We know that no blast injury is something we really want. No one wants an injury. There probably is a safe level, but we don't know exactly what it is. And we also have additional consequences for things like buildings. So Amanda showed you that blast curve. We have consequences, oh, it doesn't work, does it? With walls and things like that. So the blast wave can come out and then it can reverberate against walls. We call this a reflection of the blast wave. And that can come through the body and go back and come through again, and it can actually worsen the injury. So I really love this photo up here of the blast wave. So we have this is a huge explosion. It's very difficult to see a blast wave. In fact, you won't see a blast wave. This is some kind of a high-speed camera they were able to capture this with. But it feels like a big gust of wind, and that's essentially what it is. As Amanda said, we have this big release of energy. So you will never see this coming, but it comes as the front. So it's often called a blast front because it comes first. And so we have this curve down here. This is called a Friedlander curve. This is the kind of thing we can model in the lab. This is what we think a blast wave should look like. But as you can see here, we're looking at time in milliseconds. So this is something that happens super, super quickly. And instead often of seeing this tail that kind of drops off, we see it coming up, coming down, coming up, coming down. So we have this sort of alteration where we have overpressure, underpressure, overpressure, underpressure, which can really cause consequences not only for the brain but for the rest of the body. So how does blast affect the body? Well, blast injuries really love air and they really love liquid. So what is the human body and our organs? Sacs of air and liquid. So Amanda said the brain is kind of soft and squishy, much squishier than you think it is, and it's restrained within the skull. But we also have this transfer. So a blast wave is, we can think about it as energy. So a wave comes, we have transfer of what we call kinetic energy. So energy that has its own force, it's got its own power, it's moving of its own accord, that come in through the body. It can travel through organs, so gas-filled organs like the intestines. It can travel up through our respiratory system, but what it really likes is blood and lymph. And so the blast wave can come up, the energy can come up and it can go directly into the brain. And so this is why the brain, although all the organs can be exposed to blast injury and can be damaged, this is why the brain is really susceptible. And particularly in the cerebellum, we have blood vessels that come up, and the way the structure is, we have these big blood vessels that come and supply the cerebellum and cause this damage. So we have different kinds of blast. There are primary blast, which is blast hits body, nothing else happens. There are secondary blast, where there's a penetrating injury component as well. There's also a tertiary blast where the body is thrown back and has another physical injury. And there's also, I don't know if it's on there, a quaternary blast, which usually has a fire component as well. So they tend to be larger explosions. So it's a little bit like saying, someone said to me today, and I thought it was a really fantastic way to say it. They said, oh, maybe a primary injury is less of an injury than a quaternary injury, but it's like saying, oh, your cancer is more mild, don't worry about it, it's fine. It's all injury, it's all something to be concerned about and something that we should be paying attention to. So we have these blast effects, we have this shock wave, we have this interaction between the head and the body, we have this pressure wave which can come indirectly or it can be a direct exposure. And one of the things actually that we don't tend to think about in the way that blast is very different from a concussion or another kind of brain injury is rather than just hitting on the body or the head, it goes directly through the body or the head. And so I used to work with the Canadian military, and I would say to the guys and the girls, have you ever had a blast injury? And they'd say, oh, no, ma'am. But when you say, have you ever felt like there's a big gust of wind that's gone through your body and it's sucked your guts up into your chest, and they know exactly what you're talking about. They say, yes, all the time. And I can see a few people nodding as well. You know exactly what I'm talking about. So we have these two different ways. Both of them can happen at the same time that can cause these tissue response mechanisms. And I won't go into these different kinds of things, but different kinds of things can happen to the tissue, none of which we want. So then we have that translating into the biological response. So we have that primary damage that occurs at the time of the injury. We also have autonomic system dysfunction. So we have that fight or flight response can be activated and can be misactivated. We also have more blood load. So we have changes in our blood flow. And we have, as I said, the immune system. We have changes in our hormones as well. And then what that looks like in a person is that we can have multi-organ damage. So as I said, it's not only the brain, it can be the lungs, gastrointestinal tract. So often one of the things that we ask people is, do you have any issues with IBS that you didn't have before? Or do you have any swelling of lymph nodes on a certain side of your body that was exposed to blast? And that's actually very common and something we don't know a lot about, but we're seeing these kind of consequences not only for the brain. We see neuroendocrine systems, we have a lot of hormonal changes which are very underappreciated. And we see these kinds of chronic conditions where we have, as I said, multi-organ impairments, and eventually, unfortunately, we often have degenerative processes as well. So this is a figure we had in a paper a few years ago that wasn't specific to blast, but I think it really encapsulates what happens over time. So we have all this pathology that we've talked about that happens in the hours and days. Over months, we think this kind of bubble, some of it will resolve and a lot of it will kind of bubble along at a low level. So we'll have our inflammatory response, our immune system. We'll start to see some changes in our brain tissue. Sometimes people will develop epilepsy. We see some people start to get autoimmune diseases. So some people start to get things like MS. We don't really know why, but we think it may be related to the brain injury. Things like depression is a big one, even things like diabetes, which is sometimes a hormonal condition. And we think that over years, people start to have this cognitive dysfunction which emerges over time. So they're having problems with their memory, they're having problems with their impulse control, they're having problems paying attention. But the difficulty is, if I said to you, have you felt a little bit depressed or down or anxious, or have you had trouble sleeping, or have you had difficulty concentrating? Do you have headaches? Well, probably everyone in the room has at some stage in the last week. So it's really difficult to tease out what's related to the brain injury and what's just general life. You may have heard of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. We say CTE because it's a lot easier to say. This is something that isn't new, but we're only hearing about it now in the media and mostly with relationship to sports people. So actually it's been described for decades, actually I think definitely more than 100 years. They were calling it dementia pugilistica, which is punch drunk syndrome. So they say, oh, we've got these boxers, they're getting hit in the head repeatedly. Of course they're sort of slurring words and they're, they've got gait issues and things like that. So 100 years ago we thought, yeah, of course, you've got hit on the head all the time. Well, that's just what happens. But now we've had this resurgence and we've started to see it more and more and have more and more diagnosis. So it is what we call a terminal diagnosis. So we can only diagnose it once someone's passed away, which makes it really difficult because people want answers. If they're not feeling well, they want to go to a doctor and say, hey, I've got these things, can you look in my brain and tell me if I've got CTE or not? We cannot yet. There's lots of cognitive features, psychological features, other kinds of symptoms which overlap, but there's no consensus on exactly what it looks like. It's very controversial, I would say now. We can say definitively that it's linked to repetitive injuries. How causative it is, we don't know, because there's people who have lots of head injuries and never develop CTE. A minority of people will develop CTE. And military people, even with a lot of blast exposure, tend not to develop CTE. It's much rarer in blast exposure than it is in sports. We don't know why, we're only just starting to scratch the surface. But essentially what it is an accumulation, or what the end point is an accumulation of these tau proteins. And they're the ones that hold the microtubules together, if you remember in the video. So these sort of break off and they go into different parts of the brain. And as it gets more and more advanced, we can do what we call staging and say this person has stage 4, which is the worst, or this person only has a little bit, which is stage 1. But as I say, the evidence is coming up more and more that this isn't something which happens a lot with military. So I thought to finish off, I'll show you some research that I've done and some colleagues have done in veterans specifically. So The interest, I guess, for us is that veterans, people leave the military, they, especially in Australia, aren't getting a lot of follow-up. We don't really know what's happening in the brain, but we think that there's long-term changes that are happening. And we think, as I said, that it's kind of a slow boil. And so we're really interested in trying to understand a bit more about that so we can try and prevent problems from occurring. So this is a study we did a couple of years ago where we were looking at, are there changes in the brain structure in veterans who've had a history of blast exposure? And so this is our brain from the side, different parts on the side. This is from the front and this is from the top. So this is a bit closer to the bottom. And so what we're looking at is changes in the grey matter. So we've got our white matter that has our axons, and then we have the grey matter which has the neurons. And we were looking, is there less grey matter in veterans who've had a blast exposure? But the difficulty is really compared to who. So if we're doing a research study, we may compare people to healthy controls, but most healthy controls are just kind of people who have regular office jobs. They don't have the kind of occupational stress that military personnel do. So they don't have the uncertainty, they don't have the changes in routines, they don't have deployments, they don't have potentially shift work, they don't have the kinds of other environmental risks that aren't blast injury but could contribute. So that's always an argument. Could it just be kind of a chronic stress thing? And so we compared these people to police, to fireys, to prison guards who have that kind of similar occupational stress. And we found, so all these blobby bits here are areas where there's reduction, so there's less grey matter in our military veterans compared to the occupational stress. And so Amanda was talking about the different lobes. These are our temporal lobes here, and they tended to really be around the temporal lobes and around the cerebellum at the back as well. And so the idea, we can't with this study, so I did this in Canada, I'm obviously now here, but the idea is that we would follow people up to see, is this something that happens but then it's static, or is this something that gets worse over time? So I was talking about metabolism changes where we need more energy to come into the brain. This is a study that some colleagues did at a VA hospital in Seattle in the US, where they did something called a PET scan. So a PET scan is, they inject a chemical before you have the scan, and the chemical goes and binds to certain things in the brain. In this case, it was binding to glucose. And then we image over time and we can see how much glucose is being used. And so what we want to see is blue. And so we're comparing it to a normal brain. And here we're comparing healthy people compared to people who've had a blast injury. And these are veterans as well. And you can see we've got these areas of yellow and green, which is less metabolism, hypometabolism. Hyper would be too much. So poor use of glucose, not enough energy getting to these parts of the brain, essentially. What's really interesting about this is it tends to be around the cerebellum, and that's where we saw that volume change quite frequently, and the temporal lobes as well. And in some data that I can't show you for various reasons, we found that when we looked at brain function and blood flow that was happening, so we can do a task, you can say count to 5 or whatever, and we can look at the way the blood flows in your brain and see what's happening when you're doing that task. And we found that a lot of that brain activity that should be at the front of the brain went to the back of the brain, went to the cerebellum. And so what's really interesting about that is the cerebellum is the oldest part of the brain. This is sort of our lizardy brain. And we used to think that the cerebellum, so Amanda said the kind of classic things that the cerebellum does, it controls our gait, it controls our speech, those kinds of things. But actually the more recent evidence shows that the cerebellum can do everything the rest of the brain can do, pretty much. So what we think is happening is that we have this oldest part of the brain is almost like taking over and saying, I'll take over the tasks, I'll do all the activity, and I'll spare the rest of the brain, which is injured. We're still working on this data now. This is something we think is super interesting. We also have experimental modelling data showing that the cerebellum is the most vulnerable area as well. So it's a bit of a strange situation where the cerebellum is taking over, but the cerebellum is also injured itself. So It's an interesting research space. I mentioned before that we have hormonal changes. So one thing we see a lot is a reduction in testosterone. So testosterone, and this is in men and women, so testosterone we want to be within a certain level, and we want it to be in check with cortisol as well, which is a stress hormone. So we have this thing called a testosterone and cortisol ratio, and if it's not kept in check, if it goes too far one way or too far the other way, we tend to be anxious, depressed, we tend to be irritable, have mood swings. So a decrease in testosterone we see here, not a decrease in cortisol. And this is causing people, we think, to have these kinds of irritability, mood swings, these kinds of things, which tend to be the kinds of symptoms that people report with a history of blast injury. So I thought finally I'll show you a little bit of animal data that my colleague did a couple of years ago now. Because one of the things people always say is, oh well, yeah, blast injury, let's just get better helmets. The helmets are not good enough. We need better helmets. So these are our little rats here that have been exposed to blast injury. So you can see here, these coloured bits here are inflammation. And we're looking at inflammation changes over time. So if we have no body protection, no shielding whatsoever, we have inflammation that goes up into the brain. It gets a little bit better over time, but we see it all around the gut, we see it around the heart, we see it throughout the body. If we have the best head protection in the world, so the blast cannot get into the head, cannot pass through the skull, we still see all this inflammation coming in through the brain because it's coming from the other parts of the body. But if we shield only the body, if we shield only the torso with the best shield we can ever imagine, we get almost no inflammation coming into the brain, and that it doesn't come in over time. So actually, if we have only the choice of protecting the head or the body, we really should be focusing on protecting the body so that we can protect the head. So I think I wanted to finish up just to talk about what the kinds of things we can do to try and understand blast injury, what can we do to prevent these kinds of injuries occurring and having kind of chronic consequences, and what we can do for veterans living with these injuries. So the kinds of things we need to be doing in active military personnel are monitoring and understanding what safe exposure limits are, if there are safe exposure limits. So when I worked with the Canadian military, I said, what are the exposure limits that we have for our weapon systems? And they said, oh, we use what the US use. And so I went to the US and I said, what are your exposure limits for different weapon systems? And they said, oh, we think this and we think this, so you need to be a certain distance away, and you can only have X amount of blasts a day, depending on what weapon system. And I said, how did you come to that? And they said, oh, a few of us got together and we said, that sounds about right. And okay, so the US have since done, just quite recently, an analysis where they have worked out what the levels they think should be. So what kind of exposure, if you're throwing grenades, how many grenades can you throw? How far away should you be? If you're firing a recoilless rifle, how many times can you fire it in a day, and how long do you need to stand down before you can fire again? We're using the US data. We don't know if it's applicable for us and our personnel, so we need to be understanding this in our people and understanding it for every weapon system, because it's probably not the same for every weapon system, and it's probably not a universal truth for every person. So some people may be able to go back to training quicker, and some people might need more time. So we need to understand how people differ, what's happening. So we need to be doing things like looking at the brain with different kinds of scans. We can look at those biological markers, those we call them biomarkers in the blood. And we also need to be using blast gauges as well, so we can understand what's going on. And then we've got our little guy here with the flag. We need to actually be enforcing, and especially for our trainers, to say, you can only have this amount of exposure, because the trainers are the ones who cop it a lot, because they're out there every day with the weapon systems training people. To help with our veterans and even to help with our military personnel, we really need to listen to them. So I mentioned that their symptoms are really heterogeneous, but we need to be listening to what people are saying and questioning back, could this be a blast injury? So we often see a conflagration of blast injury compared to PTSD, because the symptoms can overlap quite a lot. So there probably are people who've been diagnosed with PTSD who may have PTSD as well. It can be quite comorbid, but there may be people who have just had a blast injury and we can't treat them appropriately if we don't know what their injury is. Another thing that we can do, and something that David mentioned that Amanda and I and himself have put in a grant together, is to understand how people are feeling, what their symptoms are, and what research is important to them. So we as researchers can say, oh, we think this is important, we think that's important, we should be looking at this and that. But actually sometimes when you go to people, the people that you're studying, they say, oh, I don't really care about that. What I really want to know is about this. So the best example of this is people with spinal cord injury. All the spinal cord injury researchers are trying to get people to walk again. And people with spinal cord injury say, great, I'd love to walk again, but actually I'd really like to control my bladder. Or what's more important to me is that I can control my own temperature. Walking, yeah, but so there was actually a massive shift after these conversations started to happen in spinal cord injury, and this is really where we need to go with our veterans to say, what's important to you? What do you think is a problem? What do you think we need to do about medical care? What do you think we need to be researching, and how do you think we should do it? And then what we also need to do is have people who have had blast injuries, people who we call our consumers, to be actually engaged in the research. So not just being told what the research is going to be about or asked what they think is important, but actually embedded in the research to say, what's the research direction? How are we going to do this? And then to evaluate the results and say, yes, this resonates with me, or no, I don't actually agree with that. And then we need to feed that information back into our active military as well. And I think that's it for me. Thank you very much.
So please give them a good round of applause.